The first time Issac Zeller entered the alien outpost on Virla 9, he was bleeding from the shoulder, mud caked from the knees down, and had a crude field dressing that looked like it had been applied mid-sprint. The outpost was run by the Tarsari Dominion, a reptilian species that had only recently signed the fragile ceasefire accord with Earth's unified coalition. The building itself resembled a collapsed cathedral, arched walls of bone-white resin and floors that hummed faintly beneath his boots. It was meant to be neutral ground, a shared staging area for peacekeeping missions. The Tarsari guard at the entrance didn't move when Issac staggered in. "Medical wing?" Issac asked, his voice hoarse and dry. The guard blinked both sets of eyelids slowly, then pointed down a corridor without a word. Issac nodded once and began walking, his left hand pressed tightly to the blood-soaked bandage. His right arm was heavy with gear, his rifle slung and secured, and on his pack, just below the flag insignia, was the unmistakable painted white skull. He didn't notice the way the guard's head tilted slightly at the sight of it. 2 hours later, Issac sat on a cot, shirtless, while a Tarsari medic named Krel applied a synthetic skin patch to his shoulder. "You will not regain full range of motion for 8 solar rotations," Krel said, his long fingers pressing around the wound, "but the fibers are binding correctly." "Yeah," Issac muttered, "feels like someone stapled my nerves to a lightning rod." Krel stared at him a moment, then returned to his instruments. "Your species exaggerates pain. Fascinating." "I'm not exaggerating," Issac muttered. "I'm just not screaming. There's a difference." Krel paused. "I see." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Why do your soldiers decorate themselves with death symbols?" "What?" Krel gestured toward the gear piled on the chair beside the cot. "The skull, markings of extinction. I've seen them painted on armor, weapons, ships. It is not a rank or unit designation. Why do you do it?" Issac's expression didn't change, but he leaned back slightly on the cot. "That's complicated." "Explain." "You sure you want to know?" Krel stared at him, unblinking. "Yes." Issac didn't answer right away. He picked up his canteen, drank, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "All right, but I'm gonna need my gear back for this." Krel handed it over without hesitation. Issac pulled his vest onto his lap and ran his fingers along the painted skull. It was hand-done brush strokes still visible, white over black. The lines were rough but deliberate. "Back on Earth," Issac began, "we've got a long history of wearing the face of death into battle. Some of it's intimidation, sure, but some of it's about memory, about what came before." He looked up at Krel. "You ever fought something so terrifying, so overwhelming, that the only way to survive was to become something it feared?" Krel didn't answer. "We have," Issac said, "and we learned that sometimes the only way to face death is to wear its face first." Krel tilted his head. "You believe death fears you?" "No," Issac said, "but sometimes it hesitates." Before Krel could respond, a distant alarm sounded. A series of rapid thumps echoed from somewhere deeper in the facility, followed by a burst of static over the intercom. "All personnel secure your sectors. Unidentified object approaching perimeter." Issac stood, wincing slightly as he pulled his shirt over the fresh patch. "Guess story time, over." Krel moved quickly toward the door. "You are not cleared for combat." "I'm not looking for a fight," Issac said, buckling his vest. "But I know that sound. That's not just a proximity alert, that's a breach warning." Krel hesitated, then handed Issac a sidearm. "Do not engage unless necessary." Issac nodded, always the plan. The corridors were suddenly alive with movement. Tarsari soldiers, tall and sinewy, moving with a strange, fluid grace, their weapons humming low. Issac's boots thudded heavier against the floor as he followed them toward the staging area. No one questioned his presence, though more than one set of eyes lingered on the white skull painted across his vest. When they reached the outer observation chamber, the source of the alarm became obvious. Floating just beyond the perimeter field was a ship, angular, black, and unfamiliar. It was Tarsari, it wasn't human, and it wasn't responding to hails. Issac turned to the nearest officer, a Tarsari with a yellow crest running from brow to neck. "Any idea who that is?" "No," the officer replied. "Its markings do not match any known registry. It has made no attempt to communicate." Issac stepped closer to the viewport, eyes narrowing. "Then it's not here to talk." The field shimmered once, then again, then failed entirely. The ship pulsed and 3 figures emerged onto the surface bipedal, armored in deep violet, their forms shifting subtly as if the air around them bent in deference. One of the Tarsari soldiers whispered something in their native tongue. Issac didn't need a translator to figure it out. It was the kind of silence that came before panic. The figures advanced. Issac stepped back, drew his weapon, and waited. When the breach came, it was fast and brutal. The intruders moved like liquid metal, cutting through the outer guard within seconds. The first Tarsari to fire was split in half before his weapon left his shoulder. Issac didn't hesitate. He fired twice, moved left, fired again. One of the intruders flinched, staggered back, and hissed in a voice that sounded like 1,000 echoes. More Tarsari fell. Issac grabbed a downed soldier's rifle, slung his own over his back, and moved toward the fallback point. "Krel," he shouted, "get the medics out. I cannot leave the wounded. You'll all be wounded if you stay." Krel hesitated, then nodded sharply and began shouting orders in Tarsari. Issac ducked behind a column, waited for one of the intruders to pass, then lunged. He fired point blank into the side of its helmet. The creature dropped, twitching. He turned only to be caught by a heavy strike across his ribs. The impact hurled him into the wall. Pain exploded through his side. He staggered, dropped the rifle, and fell. The intruder raised a curved blade, then paused. It seemed to notice the skull on Issac's chest. There was a sound, low, guttural, almost a rasp. Then the creature stepped back slowly, cautiously, before vanishing into the shadows. Issac gasped, clutching his side. He couldn't move. Something was broken, multiple somethings. Krel appeared moments later, dragging him to safety. "You should be dead," the medic said. "Yeah," Issac coughed. "Tell that to the guy who just backed off when he saw my vest." Krel stared at the skull again. "I want the rest of that story." Issac passed out before he could answer. He woke up 3 days later in the Tarsari infirmary. His ribs were fractured, 2 of them displaced. He'd need 6 weeks minimum before he could move without pain, and longer before he'd be cleared for deployment. Krel was there when he opened his eyes. "You survived," the medic said. "Barely. I reviewed the footage. The intruder who struck you, he saw the skull. He stepped back. He did not strike again. Why?" Issac exhaled slowly. "Because it's not just a decoration, it's a warning." Krel frowned. "Of what?" Issac looked at him, voice low. "That we've already seen death, laughed in its face, and we came back wearing its skin." Krel didn't respond. He stood, stepped back once, then again. Then he left the room quietly. It was dusk on Virla 9's 4th rotation since the incursion. The facility's outer hull was still being patched, scorched sections sealed with reactive gel that hissed whenever the wind shifted. Inside, movement had slowed. Most of the wounded had been stabilized or evacuated, and the temporary command center buzzed with low, clipped voices and occasional bursts of encrypted chatter. Issac sat upright in the infirmary chair now, ribs bound under a tight compression wrap, face pale but alert. His left arm rested in a sling made from the lining of a Tarsari field cloak, which he suspected had not been approved for such use. He hadn't asked. No one had stopped him. Across from him, Krel adjusted the settings on a translucent console that hovered midair. The interface shifted in color with every input, occasionally flickering in frustration at the human's proximity. "I'm not interfering with your gizmo," Issac muttered. "You emit a disruptive electromagnetic field, possibly from the implants," Krel replied, not glancing up. "Could also be my winning personality. You humans measure charm through sarcasm. This is inefficient." Issac leaned back, wincing slightly as the brace pressed into his healing ribs. "No, we measure it by how many people don't try to stab us in the first 10 seconds. Krel looked up then. "That standard would leave most of your kind categorized as failures." "Well, yeah, but we're persistent failures." A door at the far end of the infirmary opened with its usual sharp hiss, and a Tarsari officer entered, one of the higher-ranking types, judging by the silver-lined crest running along his brow. His gait was stiff, ceremonial, more accustomed to standing at podiums than ducking shrapnel. He paused when he saw Issac, his eyes narrowing, then stepped closer. Krel rose, bowing slightly. "Commander Vroth." "I have reviewed the incursion footage," Vroth said, "and the aftermath. You were involved." "Involved is one way to put it," Issac said. "Another would be actively trying not to die." "You were injured and yet continued to engage." "Wasn't a lot of options. They weren't exactly holding a bake sale." Vroth's eyes stayed fixed on him. "The last intruder who encountered you withdrew without striking. This is confirmed. No explanation has been found in Dominion records. Issac didn't respond. Vroth stepped closer. What did you do? Krel shifted slightly, but Issac didn't move. I bled on the floor and hoped they didn't notice my broken ribs. That is not an answer. You want one, Commander? Issac's tone was even, but his gaze didn't waver. Maybe they saw something they didn't understand. Maybe that scared them more than a gun. Vroth's crest twitched. You believe fear is a tactical weapon. I think confusion is more effective. Fear wears off, confusion lingers. Krel interjected, there is no strategic consistency in the intruders' behavior. They attacked without negotiation, bypassed security protocols, ignored energy barriers. Issac nodded. They weren't here to make a statement, they were testing us. Vroth turned sharply to Krel. Run a full analysis of the ship's energy signature. I want all trajectory data before night cycle. Already begun. The commander offered Issac one last glance, then strode out without another word. Issac exhaled. He's got the warmth of a frozen cactus. Krel made a whirring sound deep in his throat. You refer to your native flora often. I have compiled a list of over 200 metaphors. None are consistent. That's how you know they're authentic. Krel tilted his head. You should rest. Your vitals are unstable. You have not completed a full sleep cycle since the attack. I've slept worse. You have said that about every environment you have been in. Still true. Krel stepped closer. You are exhibiting signs of systemic stress. The pain inhibitors are not designed for continuous override. I'm fine. You are not. Your blood pressure is irregular, and your body is compensating for microfractures in the third and fourth costals. Issac flexed his fingers. If it gets worse, I'll scream dramatically and fall over. Deal. Krell's response was cut off by a sudden tremor, brief but sharp. The lights flickered. A warning tone echoed through the hall, not the same as before, lower, rhythmic. What's that? Issac asked, standing despite the lurch in his side. Krel moved to the console, scanning rapidly. Seismic disturbance, not natural, originating beneath the facility. Issac blinked. You've got underground tunnels. There are maintenance shafts and subthermal conduits, nothing that would explain this. Another tremor, this one longer. The floor vibrated beneath his boots. Krel activated a comm node. Security report. The reply was garbled, filled with static and a single intelligible word, breach. Issac grabbed the sidearm from the wall locker, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. You got armor down here. There is a storage vault 3 levels below. Let's go shopping. They didn't make it far before the first explosion hit. A heat vent ruptured down the corridor, spewing molten gas and shards of alloy. Krel shielded his face as Issac dove behind a bulkhead, the air filled with smoke, tinged with something acrid. From the haze, 3 figures emerged, more of the same intruders, but these moved differently. Slower, more deliberate. One of them carried a device, a cube, covered in shifting glyphs, pulsing faintly. Issac raised the weapon. You recognize that thing? Krel stared. No. The lead intruder stepped forward, its faceplate adjusted, revealing a mesh of organic and synthetic textures. It didn't speak, it didn't need to. It pointed directly at Issac. Krel pulled a cylindrical device from his belt and activated it. A shimmering barrier formed between them and the attackers, not solid but enough to distort vision. They're not breaching defenses, Issac said. They're looking for something. Krel didn't answer, he was focused on the cube. The intruder stepped through the residue of the barrier like it wasn't there. Issac fired twice. The shots glanced off, not even slowing it. He ducked as a projectile punched the wall behind him, showering sparks. Krel threw a spherical object at the ground, a flash emitter. It detonated in a burst of blinding light, and for a split second, the world turned white. When Issac's vision cleared, the corridor was empty. No intruders, no cube, just the smell of scorched metal and something faintly sweet like burnt fruit. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. That thing was scanning me. They are cataloging, Krel said, not exterminating, not yet. Issac looked at him. Why me? You wear symbols of mortality, you act in defiance of logic, you should not be functioning, yet here you are. You think they're curious. Krel didn't respond. An hour later, they stood in the lower vault where the Dominion stored emergency equipment. The room was circular, lined with lockers lit from within. Krel handed Issac a reinforced vest, less advanced than standard Tarsari armor but adaptable. As he strapped it on, Krel watched him. You are aware that continued engagement will result in permanent damage. Probably. Then why do it? Issac adjusted the shoulder clasp, because I'm not here to be safe. Krel tapped a screen, a schematic appeared. The cube's energy pattern traced a path downward into the old geothermal ducts, unmapped, unmonitored. Issac studied it. That's where they're going. Or where they came from. Either way, Issac said, we're not waiting for them to come back. Krel didn't argue. They moved out together into the lower levels where the lights grew dimmer and the walls were lined with old maintenance glyphs half erased by time. Issac's side throbbed with each step, but he didn't slow. Somewhere ahead, the intruders were waiting. And this time, he wasn't planning on bleeding alone. The descent into the geothermal ducts began with 92 vertical meters of rusted ladder and ended in a pocket of stifling heat that made Issac's undershirt cling like second skin. The walls were curved and coated with mineral deposits, and the air tasted faintly of copper and ozone. Krel moved ahead, his gait steady despite the rising temperature. His species had evolved in convection-heavy environments. He didn't seem to notice the heat. Issac, meanwhile, was already regretting every breath. I'd kill for a fan, Issac muttered. Krel didn't turn. You have repeatedly expressed this desire toward inanimate objects. Is this a ritual? No, it's just something we say when we're miserable. Then you are always miserable. Not always, Issac said. Sometimes I'm unconscious. The tunnel narrowed 20 meters in. Pipes ran overhead in a crisscross of forgotten infrastructure, some dripping with condensation, others completely calcified. The low hum of the facility's geothermal core pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. Krel stopped near a junction where a faint, iridescent smear marred the wall. He ran a scanner over it. The readout displayed a pattern of shifting wavelengths that made Issac's eyes ache. Residual energy, Krel said, same signature as the cube. They go deeper. Krel nodded once. Of course they do, Issac mumbled, wiping sweat from his brow with the edge of his sling, because nothing terrifying ever comes from the lobby. They moved again, the tunnel sloping downward now, steeper with each step. The floor had changed, no longer metal but some kind of fused glass, smooth and slightly concave. Issac tapped it with the toe of his boot. It echoed. Krel slowed. We are near the subthermal exhaust chamber. It has not been accessed since the station was constructed. Then why's the floor shiny? Good question. They emerged into a chamber that stretched far wider than the schematic had indicated. The ceiling was lost in shadow, and the only illumination came from the occasional pulse of red light behind the wall panels. In the center stood the cube. It hovered a meter off the ground, spinning slowly, symbols shifting across its surface like ink suspended in oil. Around it, the same violet armored figures stood motionless, 5 of them, each facing outward in a pentagonal formation. Issac raised his weapon instinctively. They're not moving. They are interfacing, Krel said. With what? Krel pointed to the floor. With this. It wasn't just glass. The entire chamber was a power conduit, and the cube was syncing with it. They're turning it into a transmitter, Issac said. Or a receiver. One of the figures turned its head. Krel stepped back, but Issac didn't move. I need 2 minutes, Krel said quietly. If I can isolate the cube's frequency, I can destabilize its link. I'll give you 3, Issac said, already moving toward the nearest column for cover. The first intruder stepped forward. Its movements were off, deliberate but not quite symmetrical, like each limb had a different sense of gravity. It didn't draw a weapon, just stared at Issac, then it took another step. Issac fired once. The round hit center mass and fizzled out in a ripple of blue light. The creature kept walking. Issac ducked behind the column. They've got shielding. No, Krel said from behind the console he'd deployed. They absorbed the kinetic force. The shielding is internalized. Reinforced muscle structure. Possibly synthetic latticework. Human ballistics are ineffective. Issac drew the sidearm instead. Then maybe we improvise. He waited until the second intruder started moving. Then he darted out, aimed low, and fired 3 rounds into the floor beneath its feet. The surface cracked, thin fractures spreading like spiderwebs. The creature stepped forward and its foot punched through. It staggered, one leg trapped in the brittle glass. Issac ran, jammed the barrel of the gun into the joint behind the creature's knee, and fired. This time it dropped. The others turned in unison. Krel shouted something in Tarsari too fast for Issac to catch, but the cube began spinning faster. The chamber vibrated. Now would be a great time for that destabilization, Issac shouted. Almost there. The remaining intruders advanced, not running, just walking as though they knew resistance was irrelevant. Issac grabbed a length of exposed piping from the floor and swung it into the nearest one's side. The impact echoed, but the creature barely flinched. It grabbed the pipe and threw it aside. Issac ducked, rolled under the next swing, and pulled a flare from his belt. He cracked it, shoved it directly against the creature's optic sensors. It recoiled, shrieking in a frequency too high for Krel to hear. Irritation detected, Krel said flatly. Glad I could contribute. The cube emitted a deep, thrumming sound like a whale call stretched across a turbine. Krel stood. I've severed the link. The cube froze mid-spin, then dropped. The intruders followed, each one collapsing as though strings had been cut. For a moment, the chamber was silent. Then the cube began to crack. Hairline fractures spread across its surface, and a faint mist leaked from the seams. Is that normal? Issac asked. No. Should we? The cube imploded with a soundless pop, sucking air from the room in a brief vacuum. Where it had been, a small object fluttered to the floor, a disc no larger than a coin, etched with a spiral pattern. Krel picked it up with tongs. It's a memory fragment. Of what? The disc pulsed once in his grip, then again. A projection flickered upward, hazy at first, then clarifying into a series of images. A planet scorched and cracked, structures that resembled the intruders frozen mid-motion, half buried in ash, and then a symbol, the same skull Issac wore. He exhaled slowly. They weren't just cataloging. They were identifying survivors, Krel said, from somewhere they'd already lost. To us. The projection ended. Krel placed the disc into a containment case. Perhaps not directly, but your species was involved. Issac sat on a low support beam, catching his breath. That's why they hesitated. They remembered what we look like when we don't lose. Krel didn't speak for a moment. Then, your species has a tendency to weaponize memory. We don't just remember, Issac said. We adapt. That's the part that scares people. Later, topside, the cooling vents had been resecured. The Dominion's repair crews worked in silence, and the command center had been relocated to a higher floor. Issac stood near the outer platform, overlooking the horizon. The sun was setting, casting orange across the jagged terrain. Krel approached him. They've confirmed the intruders left no trace beyond the cube. Issac nodded. Won't stop someone else from trying again. No, but next time we'll be prepared. He handed Issac a small object. It was a badge Tarsari in design, but modified. The skull symbol had been integrated into the crest, stylized but unmistakable. Recognition, Issac asked. Translation, Krel said, of what you are to us now. Issac turned it over once, then tucked it into his vest. You going back to your people? Krel asked. Eventually. Krel watched the horizon. You won't stay long. No, but I'll leave a message. For who? Issac smiled faintly. For whatever comes next. They stood in silence as the last of the sunlight dipped below the ridge, and the stars began to emerge, cold, distant, and full of questions. But for once, none of them needed answering.